Hi, I'm Jeff Cassman. Welcome to Tradition. This is a series of conversations we're having about all things traditional. If you like the traditional Mass, or you're trying to learn the traditional Mass, you're curious about all of these old things, the bells and the smells, the Latin, and the way that our ancestors worshipped and believed and lived, well, you're in the right place. And today I have my friend and frequent guest, Louis Tofari. Welcome, Louis.
Hi, Jeff. Hello, everyone out there in virtual video land.
Today we are going to have what I think is an important conversation for anyone that's interested in tradition, and that is the topic of Quo Primum, and understood through Summorum Pontificum. There have been a lot of calls, especially since the election of Pope Leo, to restore Pope Benedict's Summorum Pontificum for the Latin Mass. These were certain permissions or freedoms or recognition of freedoms that existed in the Roman Rite. And a lot of people are asking, is this the right thing to do? Do we just go backwards to where we were a few years ago, or maybe there's a better approach? And Louis, of course, is a liturgical expert, so we're here to talk about that today. Louis, could you give us some historical perspective regarding Quo Primum? Because if you're online, if you're in social media, you hear about Quo Primum a lot and what people have to say about it. Tell us, if you could, or maybe you'd rather start with Summorum Pontificum. I'll let you decide where to go with that. What are these two documents? What's their importance?
Yeah, the first thing is in addressing the calls or demands that Pope Leo restores Summorum Pontificum for the traditional Mass. And of course, these demands stem from Pope Francis supposedly abrogating Summorum Pontificum on July 16th, 2021. And the reason why they want Summorum Pontificum restored is because in this document, Pope Benedict XVI supported the legal right of the traditional Mass, and he declared that it had never been abrogated by Pope Paul VI in 1969, when he introduced the Novus Ordo Missae, or New Mass, through an apostolic constitution titled Missale Romanum. And since then, there had been a debate, you might say, whether or not the traditional Mass still had full force of law or required some type of special permission, like an indult, to be able to use it. Now, the fallacy of this demand to restore Summorum Pontificum is that the primary document that we're going to get into, titled Quo Primum, was never abrogated in the first place, as in fact Pope Benedict alludes to in Summorum Pontificum. Okay, so the argument really should be that Pope Leo XIV should be demanded to recognize the validity and legitimacy of Quo Primum as still having force of law, and that he should enforce that. Okay, by obviously saying the traditional Mass is completely allowed. So that's where I would say that's the status quo we should be at today.
And there's quite a bit behind this idea that the old Mass was never abrogated, right? It's not just your reading of Summorum Pontificum, right? There have been canonical studies at the highest levels, right? Can you point to some of those? Were they cardinals, bishops? Who were on those commissions? What did they say? When did that happen?
Yes, I can. So, for example, we have several instances. The first one would be in 1970. We have the canonical studies of Father Raymond Dulac, who was a canonist or a canon lawyer, someone specialized in canon law. And he did a series of canonical studies that were published, originally in French. They were translated into English and actually published in the Remnant newspaper by Walter Matt at the same time. They've recently been collected and reprinted in English by Te Deum Press. It's called In Defense of the Roman Mass by Te Deum Press. Defense is spelled, by the way, C-E, and as opposed to S-E. They're doing the British spelling. But this collects his canonical studies, wherein he says the Apostolic Constitution of Pope Paul VI, titled Missale Romanum, does not have the wording necessary to abrogate or derogate. In other words, either to abolish or to diminish the traditional Roman Mass. That is Quo Primum itself. Okay. So obviously it feels like from 1970 up until the 1980s, he's almost a lone wolf in coming out. There are others who are saying it's not quite as publicly as him. Obviously, during this entire time, we also have Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre and subsequently his society, St. Pius X. We also have Bishop Antonio de Castromaia of Campos, Brazil. They are also saying that the traditional Mass has not been forbidden. Okay, and they're carrying this on as well. Now, in 1986, Pope John Paul II secretly convened a commission of 9 cardinals. This was revealed by Cardinal Alphonse Stickler in New York City on May 20th, 1995, when he was so it was leaked, somehow it got leaked out, or a rumor went about that this commission had occurred, and it arrived at 2 different decisions, or 2 different conclusions. The first one was, the question was asked, did Pope Paul VI intend to abolish or forbid the traditional Roman Mass? The answer came back unanimously, no. All 9 cardinals. And if you know who some of the cardinals were on there, you would think they would have said no, and they didn't. By the way, on this commission, 2 of the prominent cardinals that were there were Cardinals Ratzinger and Stickler. So Stickler had firsthand knowledge. The second question was, may any priest still continue to say the traditional Mass? The answer came back, yes, with 1 dissenting vote. Now, these results were kept secret. This happened in 1986. This is 2 years before 1988, which people know as a watershed moment, because out of 1988 comes the Fraternity of St. Peter.
And
Okay?
so just for context, for people who may not be as intimately familiar with the chronology, 1988 is the year that Marcel Lefebvre had sought permission to consecrate new bishops to continue the work of his fraternity. That permission was granted and then pulled back, and then they got in back and forth arguments about who and dates and so forth. And he eventually consecrated those bishops at the time without papal permission to do so, and of course was excommunicated as a result. And then JP2 gave some limited permissions to the Fraternity of St. Peter to be canonically erected and continue using the old rites.
Yes, in a nutshell, that's exactly it. And I should mention that all the way up from 1970 to 1986, when this commission is secretly held, and onward into 1988, all along, the Society of St. Pius X's troubles began in 1974-75 because of the French bishops. The French liberal bishops started stirring up trouble and going straight to the Vatican, and they had a useful ear there. It was Cardinal Villot, who was Secretary of State. They fed incorrect and false information to Pope Paul VI. Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff that happened, but amongst all this is all along Archbishop Lefebvre saying we want to continue to have the right to celebrate the traditional mass, which has never been taken. And I'll go back to a couple other things. We have what's called the famous Agatha Christie indult of Pope Paul VI, which gives permission, but again, the argument is, did it need special permission? The answer is no, but they're trying to do this through the apparatus as it was. So we have the Agatha Christie indult in Great Britain, which something similar kind of happened again only a year ago, okay, when they thought something even more draconian in Traditionis Custodes was going to come out. Another Agatha Christie style petition went throughout the whole world with crazy people you never thought would come out signing this, like Mick Jagger's wife as an example. I mean, it's just funny how this happens. Okay, well, anyways, Pope Paul VI recognized Agatha Christie. He happened to like her novels. He said yes. So Great Britain got this very early indult. It helped matters that the Archbishop of Westminster was doing this as well. It even said, by the way, at Vatican II, or that for historical, cultural reasons, the traditional mass should still have a place in every diocese. People will be shocked to hear this, but Archbishop Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, he even at the end of his days, when he was in exile in Tehran as the papal nuncio there, he even wrote to Pope Paul VI and said, why not give special permission to these people who are asking for the traditional mass? This is a matter of record. He actually did that, okay? Then going forward to 1984, we have we would call it the infamous 1984 indult. Why? Because it added all kinds of restrictions, and the infamous story is the bishops would only allow you to have the traditional mass once a month when it was a full moon and on a Saturday when the color of the sky was orange, or, it was just these incredible, just absolutely just impractical things that unfortunately the faithful were being caught, and priests being caused to suffer under unduly, because again, the argument is this indult in fact contradicted the fact that Quo Primum was never abrogated and still had force of law. And this, again, is acknowledged in 1986. And Cardinal Alfonso, so this rumor got out that this had happened. And so the interesting thing is, if you guys, some of you may have heard of Father Gruner, who's of the Fatima Center. Father Gruner somehow discovered this. He was rather well connected with certain people. And Cardinal Alphonse Stickler had been invited to New York City to celebrate a pontifical mass, which was the first time it had been done in New York City since who knows when, 1970 at least. It was a big, huge deal. And while he was there, he gave a series of conferences, and then he did questions and answers. And they actually put a person into the audience, and the person pointedly asked about the legality of traditional mass, and Cardinal Stickler came out and he let the cat out of the bag, and people were shocked. He got back to Rome. He got his hand slapped for what he did because he wasn't supposed to say it. And for some reason, people didn't really capitalize on this like they should have. They didn't come out and say, look, this is confirmation that Quo Primum was never abolished. For some reason, referring to Quo Primum, citing Quo Primum, or relying on Quo Primum was like taboo outside the SSPX. It's really kind of odd that was happening that way.
And isn't that because the kind of the conventional take, what your average canonist would say, is that the promulgation of Missale Romanum automatically suppressed, abrogated, derogated Quo Primum, because the way these people think, canonists and others, is anytime there's a new document, whether it expressly states it or not, a new document on the same topic automatically replaces whatever came before. That's kind of the thinking, right?
Yes, and where Father Dulac comes in as a canonist, the legal argument he makes is the canonical language necessary to abrogate not only something that's immemorial, but carries with it the force of law of Quo Primum, is not there in this apostolic constitution of Paul VI. And by the way, we've seen this over and over again, where so language, the verbiage of some of the Second Vatican Council documents, when they were translated from the official Latin into the English, in some cases they diminished some of the expressions to make them seem more traditional. We know that, by the way, about the famous 2-volume set. You've seen it. It's got it's paperback. It's got a blue cover with yellow and white lettering on it. That's the most famous Vatican II English edition that's known. And it's been proven, it's been shown that this is not, in many cases, the translations are not that accurate. We also know they've done this with the germ of the new Mass. It came out a few years ago that the germ had been mistranslated from Latin into English about the orientation of the priest at the altar, or the celebrant at the altar, and that they had removed or changed. It said maybe said facing the people, but it was changed in English to say must be said facing the people. Just like they changed the words pro multis in the consecration formula from many to all, which is not what it says in Latin at all. Same thing in the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI, Missale Romanum. He said the English translations or general translations made into the vernacular out of the official Latin, they used a stronger language than what was used in the original Latin. So they translated as what would be abrogative language in the vernacular, but that abrogative language does not exist in the Latin. So basically, as Father Dulac says, all that Paul VI is saying is, I desire the priest to use this new book, the Sacramentary of the Novus Ordo. He's not actually really commanding it in the canonical language that we are accustomed to using. So that, again, and here's the other interesting thing too, is Father Dulac is really the only one that delved into this canonical issue the deepest. And unfortunately, his writings have only just been made available again in the last few years. I'm hoping more and more people will avail themselves of this book, because there again, you see, here is a canonist arguing the point, which in itself now has been vindicated by this secret commission of 9 cardinals in 1986, and now going further in the timeline in 2007. Pope Benedict XVI, in Summorum Pontificum, unequivocally declares that the traditional Mass was never forbidden. What does that mean? It means that Quo Primum was never abrogated. It was never abolished. It still has force of law. It is still the law of the church. Now, interesting enough, Pope Benedict himself, again, does not quote Quo Primum directly. He just says traditional Mass has never been forbidden. He says the Mass of Pope John the 23rd, according to the 1962 Missal, has never been forbidden, which is Quo Primum is printed in the front of that. So obviously that's the law. That's, everyone knows that. Okay. So again, we have this, once again, affirmed in 2007. Going forward to 2009, in August, we have Cardinal Dario Castiglione Hoyos, who was then president of the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei. This is set up in 1988 in reaction to the Episcopal consecrations. It's what the Fraternity St. Peter depended upon, and any other groups like Les Barous, the Benedictine monks, etc., etc. He stated on Vatican Radio, and it was republished on Zenit, which is Zenit. If you don't know what Zenit is, it's basically one of the official news organs of the Vatican. Okay. And he said, quote, priests can decide without permission from the Holy See or the bishop to celebrate the Mass in the ancient rite. And this holds true for all priests. It is the parish priest who must open the doors to those priests that, having the faculty, go to celebrate. It is not therefore necessary to ask any other permission. This is the official head of the congregation or commission that was intended to deal with the Tridenting Mass. They were intended to be the liaison for everyone for the traditional Mass. And that's what he's officially declaring. No permission necessary. You don't need to go to your local bishop. Even the priest who's underneath the parochial vicar or the pastor, he doesn't need to go to his permission. The laity want it, they should get it. That was his answer. Never corrected, never reprimanded on that. Okay, so we have all this going on until we get up to Pope Francis in 2021. Okay. And by the way, I would mention also that Cardinal Castiglione Hoyos is repeating again what Pope Benedict XVI said in Summorum Pontificum. In addition to saying the traditional Mass had never been abrogated, these various points were also made by Pope Benedict. And as one, he declared that priest needs no permission from the Apostolic See or from his own ordinary. 2, religious communities are permitted to use the traditional Mass, either partially or in whole. 3, that the laity have full rights to attend these Masses. So in other words, well, it's not just for the private celebration of the priest to do, like, okay, you can do it in the basement somewhere, but you can't do it publicly at the high altar in the church, and the parish can't attend. Okay. And 4th, that parish priests, meaning parochial vicars or pastors, should be willing to accede to the request of the faithful for the traditional Mass. So if you're going to St. Teresa Catholic Church right down the street from you, you should be able to go to that parish priest and say, I want the traditional Mass, and he should find a way to make it happen. And this was going on, and it was very successful that it was happening. As an example, in various cities in America, it began to bloom. I can tell you that Cardinal Francis George in the Archdiocese of Chicago, he was extremely supportive of this endeavor. I know of a story where he even told the seminarians in front of the entire seminary faculty staff at Mundelein, the infamous Mundelein Seminary, which he was cleaning up, that he instructed them. He says, I fully expect all of you to learn how to celebrate traditional Mass by the end of this year. And he went down the line of all the faculty members, from the chancellor of diocese to the rector of seminary to the vice rector of seminary, saying, you agree, yes, your eminence, yes, your eminence, yes, your eminence, all the way down the line, right in front of all seminarians. He did it not just once, he did it twice. So he did this at the commencement of the seminary year, and then he did it again. I have this on very good authority by one of the priests who had been in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He witnessed this actually occurred. Jaw dropped open. Kansas City, Missouri example, we had at least 10 different places in the diocese. Chicago had at least 20 parishes offering traditional Mass as part of the regular Sunday schedule. And there was another situation where in Chicago, like other dioceses, the Archdiocese divided up into what's called deaneries. And it happens in Chicago that each deanery is headed by one of the auxiliary bishops, which actually have quite a bit of power in Chicago. And in one case, a parish priest wanted to start celebrating traditional mass as part of the regular Sunday schedule. And that auxiliary bishop who was opposed to it said no. And he says, well, Pope Benedict said so. Well, what's the problem? He said, no, we have to take it to the cardinal. So they go in front of the cardinal. And the auxiliary bishop says, well, this priest wants to do this, this, and this. And Cardinal George just listens to him. And then at the end of the auxiliary bishop saying this, and he says, and he can't do this. And Cardinal George says, well, why not? He says, well, he just can't do that. He says, the Pope said so. Yes, he can. Go and do it, Father. You got my permission. You have my blessing. You don't even need my blessing. Just do it. Okay? Of course you can do it. So there was a lot of good things that were coming out. The good news. So what I want to say is I don't want to put down Summorum Pontificum entirely. The benefit of Summorum Pontificum, the positivity of Summorum Pontificum, what we're supremely thankful about Summorum Pontificum is that Pope Benedict had the courage to come out and say this traditional mass still has full legal force. Every Roman Catholic, priest or laity, has a legal right to the traditional mass. And even Pope John Paul II didn't come out to say that. Instead, he enforced this draconian 1984 indult even after 1988. Okay, even though those in the PCED, Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, they themselves didn't want to enforce these indult conditions. Okay, but again, so this is what's the great thing about what Pope Benedict did. But here's the thing: is you don't rely on Summorum Pontificum, which itself is relying on Quo Primum. It's Quo Primum you need to rely on. That is the foundation. It's like you don't rely on the framework of your house for its stability. You rely on its foundational walls. That's what you rely on. Okay. So this is the thing: is I don't want to knock down Summorum Pontificum, because in the sense what Pope Benedict did by affirming Quo Primum still is legally enforced, that's terrific. But unfortunately, after 7/7/2007, July 7th, 2007, that's easy to remember, 7707. How can you forget that? Everyone was talking about Summorum Pontificum, and then after, when it was supposedly suppressed, again, restore Summorum Pontificum, and never a peep about Quo Primum. I feel like a lone wolf out there because I've been saying Quo Primum for, I don't know, over 20 years. But for some reason, people, I don't know if they just don't understand it. They just don't know the facts. Maybe we just brought out with the timeline where it's been affirmed again and again that no, Quo Primum still has force of law. Okay. And again, to go into what Pope Francis did, he did not abrogate Quo Primum. He did not abrogate it. Okay. So with Traditionis Custodes. Okay. I would even argue he didn't abrogate Summorum Pontificum. You can go deeper into things about it, but I would say first and foremost, obviously it's an injustice. Okay. And the Pope just can't do anything arbitrarily when it comes to this kind of discipline, especially one of immemorial status of Quo Primum. Okay. In this case. All right.
And I think that there's an important thing to say here. Quo Primum was an apostolic constitution, a papal bull. This is a document with the highest authority. And so, and what it did was essentially codify, regulate, organize the Roman Rite across Europe in particular. There were other rites that pre-existed and were from other places that were not governed by that document. And so when you're going back to 1570 and saying this is a document that's still in force, it's not been canonically specifically replaced. That gets to the use of that missal, the 1960, what we now call the 1962.
Right.
What we're not saying is that the Mass can never be changed or altered, or that the text of the liturgy can't be modified, right? Because there's some people who
That
think
that
that's
is correct. And I think to understand, we need to go back. You made a bunch of great points about what Quo Primum. I think we need to go back, circle back real quick to let's discuss what is Quo Primum, because it's often misunderstood what it is. It's not even well known what it is. So just to explain, Quo Primum in itself is a very simple, basic document. But it becomes one of crucial importance during the post-conciliar crisis, especially the liturgical crisis that we have been suffering since, at least for the Novus Ordo Missae since 1969. So Quo Primum, as you correctly stated, Jeff, it is a papal bull of Pope St. Pius V that was promulgated on July 14th, 1570. And it promulgated a restored and codified Roman Missal or Missale Romanum. And most people be asking, okay, what's the big deal? So the first thing is, what type of document is this? As a papal bull, it is a legal document that deals with liturgical law for the Latin Church only. So for those, we got some radicals, extremists out there who want to say that Quo Primum has a greater reach than it really does. As an example, they'll say, well, Quo Primum says this, or the rubrics in Traditional Missal says this, so therefore the Novus Ordo must be automatically invalid because it doesn't fulfill that criteria, blah, blah. It's like, no, Quo Primum isn't dealing with the Novus Ordo Missae, neither are the rubrics of Traditional Missal. Neither are the Eastern rites under Quo Primum. They follow their own set of liturgical laws. So to put that aside, Quo Primum is dealing only with the traditional Latin rites of the Latin Church. Now, what's significant about Quo Primum historically is that it's the first liturgical discipline of its kind for the Latin Church universally. Previous to this, no pope ever legislated anything, at least in documentary wise, any kind of legislation that was required to be followed throughout the entire Latin Church, okay, regarding the Roman Mass or any of the other Latin rites that exist as well. Part of that was, if you know the context of the time, it was almost impossible to do that because of the way communication was back then. Plus, they're just starting to have printing presses now, okay, before missals are being hand copied and everything. All right. Now, that being said, there had been a desire and even a demand for a certain standardization of the Roman Missal for various reasons. The Dominicans had already sought to do this with their own right at least 200 years before, but were unsuccessful. So we get to the Council of Trent, and the Council of Trent basically decrees that the Roman liturgy will undergo a general reform. This general reform basically consists of hammering the various liturgical books of the Roman Rite into shape as we know them today. So just real quick, we're used today to certain books being a certain way: the Missale Romanum, the Breviario Romanum, the Pontificale Romanum, Ceremonialum Episcoporum, the Rituale Romanum, etc., etc., etc. All these books that we use for the divine liturgy, the sacred liturgy, the divine office, the administration of sacraments, the pontifical rites and ceremonies, etc., etc. Well, they weren't the way they are today at that time. Okay, so what happens is the Council of Trent says we need to get things in order. They also had to reform the entire civil calendar, which affects the liturgical calendar. So they actually do the Gregorian reform of the calendar. That gets ordered by the Council of Trent. There's an issue of doctrine going on as well regarding the Mass, the various decrees that are made regarding the Mass. Okay. But basically, the Council of Trent demands that the Roman Missal is finally, you might say, codified. Codified means that the prayers, the chants, and the rubrics of the Roman Mass are now standardized across the board for wherever the Roman Mass is celebrated in the Latin Church. And you might think, well, they were already doing that, right? No. Previously to 1570, it was literally liturgical chaos. Not only did you have priests or bishops using missals, Roman missals written all different times, but they all have different little practices. Even something as simple as the prayers at the foot of the altar were quite different, not just from diocese to diocese, but even from parish to parish. And there was all kinds of stuff going on. It was really quite a mess. The only real place where there was a standardization or unification of the same Roman Missal being used, the same prayers, the same texts, the same rubrics, was in the city of Rome, because in 1474, the Pope commanded that a printing of the Missal at that time be used in all the churches of Rome under punishment of excommunication, et cetera, whatever. Okay, so it was a chaotic liturgical situation. There were various bishops in different dioceses who were trying to deal with this in their own way prior to the Council of Trent, by them themselves mandating what edition of the Roman Missal they would use. But again, that didn't mean that that Roman Missal they were using in their diocese was the same as what was being used in Rome. And by the way, the codified Missal that Quo Primum promulgates is essentially the 1474. They had already really done some of the work, you might say, but they did spend 5 years working on the Missal. They didn't have much resources at that time to go back into more ancient texts and see, we want to also keep a certain Roman simplicity, where some of the other Latin churches had done some very more extravagant, more, you might even call it superfluous things that they were doing. So they had inherited this from via the Eastern rites, via the Gallican rite, in influencing them and make things a lot. So, for instance, our liturgies tend to be a lot longer. The prayers tended to be a lot longer. Okay, whereas the Roman ones are marked by being very short, brief, and terse. Okay, so there was a little bit of work that was done, but essentially it is the 1474 Missal in the sense that the main form was there. Now, by the way, where you did see a certain universality was the Roman canon that had managed to basically diffuse throughout the entire Latin Church. There were some regional varieties of, in some cases, where different saints could be mentioned. In the Communicantes and Nobis Quoque Patoribus, it might have been a local saint, or they were praying for during the Te Igitur prayer, they would actually name the name of the sovereign, whether it was the Holy Roman Emperor, or their king, or even possibly a duke. Later, that's removed by Quo Primum in a couple places. 100 so years later, the popes grant permission for certain areas to put it back, like in France and in Belgium. Okay. All right. Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay. So we had this very chaotic situation, and the Pope, St. Pius V, says no more, one missal for all. And you have 6 months to conform, or you're going to get excommunicated. And at the same time he does this, decrees that there must be one missal used for all Roman rite places. He also very graciously allows other liturgical Latin rites to continue to exist if they can prove they're of immemorial usage. What does that term mean, immemorial? It usually refers to 200 years or more. In other words, it's past living memory. There's nobody left alive who can remember when it began, okay. So, for instance, we have, there were several Latin rites that existed that were of immemorial usage. We had Dominican rite, Carmelite, Carthusian, the Ambrosian, there's the Mozaberic, there's the Braga rite. Unfortunately, by this time, the English rites, for instance, of the Summorum Rite, York, Lincoln, they're already gone because they were destroyed by the English Reformation, and the English priests are being trained in Douay and Reims and wherever else in France, even in Rome. They're bringing back the Roman Missal. So they're replacing the English rites with the Roman Missal now, which previously, unless you're an Italian, you wouldn't have used that Roman Missal in England. England had its own liturgical rites. And these are, by the way, influenced by Gallican. They're very elaborate and everything in what they do, especially the Summorum Rite. So, by the way, when you hear about the Catholics being persecuted for the Catholic Mass, initially, before you get like to Father or St. Edmund Campion, they're talking about the English rites that these priests are saying in secret. Then the priests start coming, the newly ordained priests start coming over from France or coming over from Rome, especially Jesuits, and these are now bringing the Roman Missal with them. These rites technically are defunct today. In a sense, they're extinct. Could they be revived by a pope? They could be. There is a story that when the English hierarchy, Catholic hierarchy, is restored to Great Britain in 1829, the story goes that the Pope offered to the English Catholics, would you like to restore your English rites, particularly the Summorum Rite, which the entire southern part of England was now fine. This came from Salisbury, by the way. Summorum is the old Latin term for Salisbury, England. Any case, they declined, and they said no. They said, first, we all know the Roman Missal. Two, it shows our connection to the Roman Pontiff, which is extremely important for us as Roman Catholics in England, which is basically Protestant, Anglican, Calvinist, puritanical today. And three, we barely have the books. We would have to go and produce all these books. It's just not worth our while. We'd have to reproduce the Missal. We'd have to reproduce the breviary. We'd have to do the ritual. And we don't really even have all these. And now they've all come out. They've been found and everything. But they're just like, nah, we're satisfied doing the Roman Missal. So that's what we will do. Okay. Now, what Pope St. Pius V does also restrict, which is also new in Quo Primum as form as legislation, is he restricts any further revisions to the Roman Missal. He restricts it to the Supreme Pontiff, to himself, the Pope. Now, Supreme Pontiff has ultimate authority over all liturgical rites in the Catholic Church, East and West. That's always been said, by the way. It's always been understood. So it's not just in the West that he has authority, but also even in the East. Now, generally in the East, they've never intervened. They've just said, you guys do what you want as long as it affirms the Catholic faith. I mean, and so when all these Eastern rites have come back into the fold from Orthodoxy or Monophysism, whatever it is, they've never been forced to say, you must give up your Eastern rite and you must become a Roman rite, a Latin rite. No, they've never been forced to do that. They may have been asked, they may have been had to correct certain theological things to assume it's affirming the Catholic faith. But as an example, the Byzantines, the Greeks, when they came back, they were not required to change the original wording of the Nicene Creed. In the Nicene Creed, it doesn't say the word filioque. Likewise to the Son, regarding the inspiration of the Holy Ghost. We added that a few hundred years later after the Council of Nicaea in the Latin Church. Okay? But all the Pope said was, as long as you affirm the filioque, the doctrine that the Holy Ghost comes from both the Father and the Son, then you can leave the Nicene Creed the way it is, because that's the way it originally was formulated. We simply added it for greater clarification in Latin. So as an example, so if you ever talk to any Orthodox, they want to go on, well, you guys want to force us to become Latins. No, we've never done that. And they'll point to the Maronites, by the way, who are in Lebanon. The Maronites actually requested for Latinizations to be added to their liturgy. They weren't forced to do it. They requested it. So when you show up in their church, you knew right away that they were united to the Pope. They required, so for instance, they're the only Eastern Rite that used to have genuflections. Okay, they're the only Eastern Rite that actually wore Roman style chasubles. Okay, there were some Latin Rite things that they personally, by the way, the genuflection only occurred at the very beginning of the Mass or the Divine Liturgy and at the very end of the Divine Liturgy. So that way, when you walked into church, you knew the genuflecting, well, they must be united to Rome because no other Eastern rites use a genuflection. By the way, that's been stripped out lately. The Maronites were asked to, for ecumenical reasons, to remove their Latinizations from their liturgy. And they do now, of course, facing the people and everything like that. Now, unfortunately, the Maronite rite has undergone some vicissitudes. Anyways, just to point that out, that the Supreme Pontiff is the only one now who was going to be allowed to make changes to the Missal. You might be saying, so what? That's always been the case. Well, no, because prior to 1570, the bishops could make changes to their Missals, and the printers to the Apostolic See could make changes to these Missals. And they did. And they wanted that to stop. And they did that actually not just merely for standardization, but standardization, another element of this was to ensure orthodoxy of the text, especially in light of the Protestant Reformation. Okay. Now in 1588, Pope Sixtus V delegated this authority, the supreme authority, to the Sacred Congregational Rites, okay, which was working under the Pope. Of course, obviously, they went to the Pope and say, Holy Father, we want your permission to do this. But basically, he gave that working authority to the Sacred Congregational Rites. The next question that we need to address is, which you touched on, Jeff, was, is Quo Primum dogmatic or ex cathedra? And the quick answer is no. It's simply a form of liturgical discipline or law. And to prove that it's not a dogmatic statement, it's not listed among any dogmatic pronouncements listed in reference works such as Henry Denziger, Sources of Catholic Dogma, or Ott. Okay, none of those sources ever list Quo Primum as a dogmatic document or ex cathedra statement. So do not represent it at that. Secondly, no liturgist or rubricist before Vatican II ever cited Quo Primum as anything other than mere liturgical law. And of course, in their context, it's simply, this is the basis or foundation for every other edition of the Roman Missal. Okay, I would even invite you to go see the 1913 edition of the Catholic Encyclopedia in English. Nowhere in there ever will you see Quo Primum ever mentioned as some type of dogmatic document. Okay, so I know people are going to say, well, Quo Primum has these famous phrases at the conclusion saying that this document stands in perpetuity, and if you ever violate it, you'll suffer the wrath of Saints Peter and Paul, and therefore the Mass can never be changed, or it's dogmatic. And that is not what it's saying. Remember who this is being directed to. If you look at the beginning, Pope St. Pius V is directing Quo Primum to the bishops and printers of the Apostolic See, telling them, you are no longer allowed to make changes to the Missal. That is now my job, and you must use this Missal. And then he continues by saying, no priest may be forbidden from using this Missal. And any rite that's immemorial, that's legitimately immemorial, may continue to be used. Okay, so he and by the way, the proof, this language, in perpetuity and suffer the wrath of Saints Peter and Paul, this is the common curial language used by the popes at that time. They would even use it to summon a bishop to Rome, to call him on the carpet. It was normal language that was used for everything back then. It doesn't, people read too much into that and they think, well, that means therefore you can't change Mass. No, you can change the Mass, and the proof is that changes can be made. So for instance, there were reforms or revisions enacted to the Roman Missal just 30 years and 60 years after Quo Primum. The first one was by Pope Clement VIII in 1604. The second one was in 1634 by Urban VIII. And furthermore, we have Pope Pius XII teaching in 1947 in his awesome encyclical on the liturgy Mediator Dei, that changes can be made to the liturgy just as long as they are orthodox. And that's really the definition of organic development. And that's a longer conversation maybe for another time, because some people confuse what organic development is and isn't, because there are certain things some people don't like about some of the revisions made up to the 1962 Missal. And they say, well, since we don't like it and they changed it, it's not organic development. It's like, well, that's not what Pope Pius XII says. And that's not what the church has always taught on this point. So Quo Primum is important because it's the legal foundation for all future revised or reform editions of the Roman Missal. It's always printed at the front of every missal up into 1965. So you see here, this is right up here in the 62 Missal, right there in the front. You've got Quo Primum printed, and after that are the two other ones by Clement VIII and Urban VIII. And then you have whatever the newest one is, either just before or just after. Okay. This is printed all the way up until 1965. The 65 Missal is the 62 with some rubrical changes, okay, textual changes, but still is the 62 verbiage wise, okay. In 1969, with the Novus Ordo Missae, they remove it. It's no longer there. If you were to pick up your Novus Ordo Sacramentary and open up, you will not see Quo Primum in there. Even though Pope Paul VI mentions Quo Primum in his Apostolic Constitution Missale Romanum, simply saying, well, what a great blessing this document was, blah, blah, now we're going to move on. Thanks to the Holy Ghost in Vatican II. Okay, the spirit of Vatican II, whatever. So again, it's kind of telling that it's not there, okay, in that respect. But in any case, that in a nutshell is the importance of Quo Primum. Again, the proper application of Summorum Pontificum, that it backs up that, look, it's not a bunch of crazy traddies alone that have said, Quo Primum's never been abolished. No, Pope Benedict XVI himself said it. Pope John Paul II's commission of 9 cardinals said it. Okay? Cardinal Castilian Hoyos of the PCED said it. Okay, so we have different people who are saying it. So it's not an isolated issue. Or I've heard people say, that's the echo box of the SSP. It has nothing to do with the SSPX. It's a Catholic issue, period. They're simply saying, we've been saying this all this time. And it turns out they were vindicated. That they were actually correct about the law of the church, that it never was abolished. So why are you punishing us for something that's completely legal? Okay, I mean, that's one of the things that was going on with them. Okay,
Louis, in our last couple of minutes here,
yeah,
what are the practical things that Catholics can do if they're told that Quo Primum was abolished, that the old Mass was abolished, that they don't have rights to these sacraments? How can they respond?
The first thing I would do is you've got to educate yourself to be able to respond correctly. So the first thing is this book, In Defense of the Roman Mass by Father Dulac, Te Deum Press. No, they are not paying me to make this advertisement. I've wanted Father Dulac's works out there in English for so long. I actually begged Michael Matt at one point, please bring these back into print in English. He said, I had to go back in an old file cabinet somewhere and find them, and we have to transcribe them. And there's a lot. I mean, this is like a 200-page, 302 pages. So there would have been a lot of work to have been done. So I'm so glad Te Deum Press brought this out, made that available. Second, familiarize yourself. We brought up different proofs. You know, you can look up about this Secret Commission of 9 by Cardinal Alphonse Stickler. Write this stuff down, put it in a Word document. You got Pope Benedict and Summorum Pontificum saying this, okay? There's other things as well. So educate yourself about this legal struggle so you know. Because to be honest, most people are ignorant. I mean, your bishop does not know. Your priests don't generally know. I mean, I've talked to lots of priests who even won diocesan priests who say the traditional Mass, they have no idea about Quo Primum because it's like the best kept secret for some reason. No one's talking about it. It's been going on for as long as I can remember, for almost 30 years that I've been involved in this struggle, over 30 years. Quo Primum is like, hush, hush. No, don't mention that. Don't mention Quo Primum. That'll put you in the corner as one of those traddies. Okay. The second thing is please correctly promote or represent Quo Primum. There's too many people out there who have written, or especially on the internet, saying Quo Primum is an infallible document, it's dogmatic, it's ex cathedra, it says that no change can ever be made to the Mass, and like, that is not what it says. Please be accurate, because you shoot yourselves in the foot when we misrepresent what that document is. It's enough to say it still has full legal force, and it's protecting the rights of all the traditional forms of the Mass, by the way, because it's not just protecting the traditional Roman Mass, it's also protecting the other traditional Latin rites, Dominican, Carthusian, Ambrosian, etc., okay, by affiliation there. Okay. I would also say, by the way, do something to encourage your priests to learn about the traditional Mass. A lot of ways this can be done, and it needs, sometimes it needs to be gradual, not in your face, you know, Father, what you're doing is wrong. I mean, remember, we've been, you know, we've had this situation, this post-conciliar situation since 1969, if you want to talk about the liturgy. For some priests and for some faithful, this is all they've ever known. Okay? It's all I ever grew up with. I never got anything. I got nothing but that. Okay? So, you know, for instance, I have several things at Romanitas Press that I offer, like two great books by Dom Gaspar Lefebvre, the Benedictine liturgist. There's a great little book called How to Understand the Mass, which is illustrated. Catholic Liturgy, Its Fundamental Principles. He wrote both of these fantastic books. He's the author, by the way, of the compiler of the St. Andrew Daily Missal. If you're familiar with that. That was his great work. Okay. I've got a bunch of other stuff on my website. If you're looking for something in particular, you can always email me and say, hey, Louis, what would you suggest? I've got I want to get a priest interested in traditional Mass. What would you suggest? And by the way, there's things that I don't even offer that I would still suggest to people, to priests as well, in that respect. But there's things that the laity can do. Education, correct promotion, and that's two ways. Make sure you advertise Quo Primum correctly. Let that Quo Primum be on your lips. And then thirdly, encourage your priests to find tradition. You know, a lot of these priests want it, but they don't even know what it is that they want.
Louis, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your time and your contribution.
Yeah, absolutely.
As always, they're great. We'll share in the show notes below this video all the links to the things that you've mentioned, as well as Romanitas Press. Thanks again for your time. God bless you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Jeff. Bye, everyone. God bless.